Section 5 of Strangers at Lisconnel by Jane Barlow. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 5. Chapter 7. Mr. Polymathers. It was to an accidental circumstance that Lisconnel owed the prolonged sojourn there of perhaps the most distinguished scholar who has ever visited us. For when he arrived at O'Byrne's forge one misty June evening, the night's lodging only was all he asked or desired. But in those times, now some 50 years since, we had a terrible deal of sickness about in the country, and next morning the stranger was down with the fever, which, although so mild a case that even Bridget O'Byrne never gave him over more than twice in the same day, brought his journey perforce to a halt. At the beginning he was very loath to believe that he must relinquish his intention of reaching Dublin by a certain day, the first Monday in July. However, having once recognized the impossibility of doing so, he showed no haste to quit his quarters, and his stay with the O'Byrnes lengthened into months as the summer slipped away. At this time the forge was owned by Felix O'Byrne, blacksmith, shearmaner, and ex-white boy, and with him lived his orphan grandsons Daniel and Nicholas, his very old ancient mother, who still drew enjoyment in whiffs through the stem of her black dudeen, and his elderly sister Bridget, who had taken little pleasure in anything since the redcoats shot her sweetheart in the war. The missing third generation was represented occasionally when Mrs. Dooley, Felix's married daughter, came on a visit. It was conjectured among them that the fancy the old gentleman had for learning all manner to young Nicholas contented him to stop, and this may have had something to do with it, though less probably than the vaguer fact that he from the first took kindly to the O'Byrnes and they to him. His appearance puzzled them a little. He was of a massive, large-boned frame, such as nature seems to design for rough uses, but, as Felix remarked, you could easy tell by every finger and thumb on him that hard work wasn't the handle he took a hold of the world by. He wore a very long grey frieze coat and a chimney pot hat so old and tall that it looked as if it must have grown slowly to its great height. When he took it off he uncovered a shock of soft white hair like the wig of a seeded groundsel, about a face which was furrowed and wrinkled ruggedly enough in a different pattern somehow from what is commonly seen at Lisconnel, where sun and wind have a large share in the process. His baggage consisted of 2 bundles, very unequal in size and weight. The contents of the smaller one were mainly a shirt and 3 socks, knotted loosely in a blue cotton handkerchief. The other was done up carefully in sacking, and he liked to have it under his eye. Of course the O'Byrnes' visitor was often talked about among the group gathered of an evening, much as they are nowadays for gossip and poteen within the broad-leaved forge doors, through which, on dark nights, the fire still blinks as far across the bog as the amber of the sunset, or the rising glow of the golden harvest moon. Even from Felix's first report it appeared that the stranger was no ordinary person. "Wonderful fine discourse he has out of him, anyway," he told the neighbours a few nights after the arrival. "Every now and again he'll out wid a word as grand like and big as his reverence at Mass. Goodness forgive me for saying so. Sometimes we've been hard set to tell what he's drivin' at, but that's the way it is wid them words that has a power of meanin' in them. They're apt to bother you a bit when you're used to spakin' plain. Belike it's the fever in his head sets him talkin' oddly," said young Barney Corcoran, I mind me brother Joe, when he was bad wid it, would be ravin' wild. Sorra the sensible word there was out of him for the best part of a week." This way of accounting for his guest's fine language rather affronted Felix, and he consequently said, "Musha now, was there not? And how long might yourself be under that description of fever?" "Ah, sure, what'd we do at all if poor Bonnie was took that way," said Peter Keogh, "and nobody able to tell was it ravin' he was, or settin' up to be talkin' reasonable, for any differ they could see?" Barney cleared his throat disconcertedly, and the old man, recalling his responsibilities as a host, and perhaps not admiring his sarcasm thus elaborated, said conciliatingly, "Och, he'll do right enough if he never raves any worse than Mr. Polymathers. All that ails him is that we want to get a bit used to his manner of speaking." "Polymathers?" said Peter. "To be sure, Polymathers. Did you say it any better than I?" "Well, I never heard tell of anybody called that way before. It's a quare she-he soundin' sort of name," said Peter. "Faix then, there may be plenty quare in it. We never heard tell of it, if that was all," said Felix. "Anyhow, it's his name, and his people's afore him. Himself told me his father was the oldest of all the Polymathersers there was in the country he came out of, somewheres down south, I think he said, and the head of the whole of them forby." "Aye, he did so," said Dan. "Says you to him, there was a deal of water run down hill since the time there was O'Beirnes's blacksmiths in this part of the country. And your father was a one, says you, and says he to you, he couldn't be any manner of means pretend to be the equal of what his father was. And says you to him, what was he? And says he, it was one of the Polymatherses he was, and well known for his learning through the length and breadth of the county Sligo. And a name it was, says he, any man might be proud of owning. Be jabbers, himself was the great conceit of it, at all events," said Peter. "But he might find people could be tellin' him there's Keoghs as good as any Polymathers ever was in it, ivery hair." The stranger's patronymic having thus been ascertained, it was desirable to fix his calling, and, despite his disclaimer of inherited erudition, several circumstances bespoke him a schoolmaster, even before the question seemed settled by the first act of his convalescence being an inquiry into the amount of book learning which Dan and Nicholas had amassed during their 16 and 14 years. This was not large, though as much as could be expected, considering that in all Lisconnel there was not just then, I believe, more than 4 volumes, one of which, being merely the index to a non-existent encyclopedia, can scarcely rank as literature. The boys themselves and their grandfather were deeply interested in the examination, and very anxious that it should have a creditable result. For learning and learned have at all times been held in profound respect among us away on our bogland, where the devotion to something afar springs perhaps the more abundantly because so many things are remote. On this occasion Mr. Polymathers opened his most sizable bundle, and it was seen to be filled with books, not fewer doubtless than a score, in leather bindings, ragged and battered, and brownly time-stained all over their margins, as if the river of years had for them run no metaphor, but a russet bog stream. They comprised Homer, Virgil, Livy, and other ancients, likewise 2 Latin lexicons, which looked extravagant until you observed how each did but supplement the other's deficiencies, and this so imperfectly that their owner was still liable to search in vain for words between M.O. and N.A. These, however, were evidently not the most prized portion of Mr. Polymathers's library, though he displayed them with some complacency, reading out here and there a sonorous foreign phrase, at which his audience said "more power" and "your soul to glory," and the like. It was when he handled the shabbiest of the volumes, with broken backs and edges all curling tatters, that his touch grew caressing. The lookers on, contrariwise, thought but poorly of them, because they set up, seemingly, to be illustrated works, and their pictures, mostly of uninteresting round and three-cornered objects, struck Lisconnel art critics as very feeble efforts. To be sure, Mr. Polymathers called them diagrams, but that was no help to the overtaxed imagination. Only young Nicholas O'Beirne listened intently to the explanation which he gave of one of them. Nicholas was a long, thin lad, with melancholy grey eyes and a square forehead, whose capacity his grandfather had held in some esteem, since it had been discovered years ago that the spalpeen could make out an account for 4 sets of shoes, and half a stone of 3-inch holdfasts, and a dozen of staples, and 2 gallons of the creature, and allow for 100 weight of old iron, all in his head, and right to a farthing. Now the melancholy eyes darkened and brightened with excitement as Mr. Polymathers discoursed on right lines and angles and circles, and expounded the mysterious signification of certain A, B, C's. And he had thenceforward an unweariable pupil in Nicholas, complained, albeit with less ardent zeal and at a slower rate of progress, by his elder brother Dan. More general interest, however, continued to be taken in the stranger's classical attainments. Everybody, the O'Beirnes themselves, their neighbours in the cabin row close by, now long since an untraceable ruin, and the people of Lisconnel proper, a couple of miles further on, felt uplifted by the residence among them of a man who they boasted would talk Latin to you as soon as look at you. But as we never enjoy our own happiness fully until it has been looked at through other men's envious eyes, they could not here remain content with simply possessing this privilege, or even with dilating upon it to their less favoured friends down below and down beyond. They longed to make a parade of it, to give a demonstration of it, and the method of doing so, which they came to consider most desirable, was the bringing about of a conversation in Latin between Mr. Polymathers and Father Rooney, the parish priest. For if that took place, they could easily imagine his reverence riding home to report in the town that a wonderful great scholar entirely they had stopping above at Lisconnel. Moreover, the conversation itself would be a real fine thing to have the hearing of. Terence Kilfoyle, for instance, said that it would be as good as a play, which, as he had never seen one, was to entertain unbounded expectations. And at last, after they had wished the wish for some weeks, a prospect of its fulfilment came into sight, together with Father Rooney's cream-coloured pony jogging along through the light of a fiery zoned July sunset, in which Mr. Polymathers was basking by the O'Beirnes' door. In those days his reverence was a youngish man, ruddy and of a cheerful countenance, a substantial load for his sturdy nag, and although in his glossy black cloth, a figure very different from their gaunt, sad-visaged, shaggily garbed old guest. He was at the time of Father Rooney's approach seated on a three-legged stool, propped precariously against the ray-roosed cabin wall, and was teaching Dan and Nicholas the 12th proposition of the 2nd book of Euclid. Dan had not yet grasped it, but it all lay as clear as a sunbeam athwart Nicholas's brain, and he was fidgeting like an impatient horse at the slowness of his fellow. Several of the neighbours chanced to be about, for the forge saw a good deal of company in those long empty days before the potato digging could begin. They all drew together into a small crowd, and closed in step by step to watch the first meeting between these two notable persons, much admiring the deftness with which old Burns secured it, by pronouncing one of the pony's shoes in need of tightening, and the felicitous opening he made by assuring his reverence that "divil a bit need he be mindin' the delay, because Mr. Polymathers there had enough furrin languages to keep them all diverted, if the beast owned as many feet as 40 legs, wid the shoes droppin' off every pair of them. That was to say, in course, supposin' he got the chance of convarsin' a bit wid somebody equal to answerin' him back illigant, the way there wasn't ever a one of them could make an offer at doin' no more than them little weevils of chirpin' chickens." Yet the interview turned out disappointingly after all. If such a thing had not been, of course, exceedingly improbable, one might have fancied that each scholar stood in awe of the other's reputation, they steered so clear of all recondite subjects, keeping to the merest commonplaces about rain and potatoes and turf, which anybody else could have discussed quite as knowledgeably. In vain, whenever there was a promising pause, would the bystanders nudge one another, whispering hopefully, "Whist, boys, they'll be saying something now." Only the plainest English followed, and at last, when Father Rooney rode on, his parting joke, which referred to the difficulty his pony would now find in the way of becoming a barefooted pilgrim, left for a wonder solemnly irresponsive faces behind it. Michael Ryan said with a touch of resentment, "Ah, well, one couldn't maybe expect it of him to be troublin' themselves talkin' fine for the pack of us, as ignorant as dirt in the middle of the ould bog." And his wife said, "'Deed now, I wouldn't wonder meself if the reason was his Reverence 'ud think bad of usin' his Latin words for anything else only prayers and such. It might be somethin' the same as if he went and took his grand vestments to go dig pitaties in, and that 'ud be a great sin, God knows." But old Felix, who was, as we have seen, a rather touchy person, construed this suggestion in an implied censure on his own wishes in the matter, and said huffily, "Sorra the talk of sin I see in it at all, ma'am. 'Tis a deal liker they just couldn't get out wid it convanient off hand. The same way that I'd easy enough bate out a shoe on me anvil there, when it's bothered I'd be if you axed me to make a one promiscuous here of a suddint on the roadside." Mr. Polymathers himself, meanwhile, was perhaps dimly conscious that he had disappointed hopes and failed to rise duly to the occasion, and this may have been why he slipped indoors and fetched out a small book he had never produced before, bound in a dingy greenish blue with a white paper label. "Do you know what that is, sir?" he questioned rhetorically, handing it to Felix O'Beirne. "It's the calendar, let me tell you, of the College of the Holy and Undivided Trinity, juxta Dublin. There's a print of the front of the buildings attached to the fly leaf. I'm after picking it up this spring at Moynalone. 'Twas new the year before last, and comprises a deal of information relative to terms, examinations, fees, and so forth." "Begor, then it looks to be a wide house," said Felix, confining himself to the picture as a comprehensible point. "It's apt to be an uncommon fine place, sir, I should suppose." "You may say that, me man," said Mrs. Polymathers emphatically. "Not its match in the kingdom of Ireland, the home of literature and the haunt of science, and it's there I'll be, pleased God, next October." "Musha, and will you be thravellin' that far, to Dublin?" said Felix. "Ay, will I, and would have gone last month only for the fever delayin' me till after the midsummer entrance. Me savin's amount to be somethin' over £30, so I may venture on the step and present myself at the Michaelmas term. In short," said Mr. Polymathers, repoising himself upon his rickety stool, "I might describe myself as an unmatriculated candidate undergraduate of the University of Dublin." "And what at all now would that be, sir, if I might be axin'?" said Felix humbly, after the awe-stricken pause which followed Mr. Polymathers' proclamation of his style and title. "It's a necessary preliminary," said Mr. Polymathers, "to proceeding to the degree of baccalaureatus in autibus, or in autibus baccalaureatus. The ordo verborum is, I take it, immaterial, to judge by the transposition of initials in the case of blank." "Faix, but it's the fine Latin you can be discoursin' now, and his Reverence half ways home," said Felix reproachfully. Mr. Polymathers, glancing round a circle of deeply impressed faces, felt that his prestige was restored, and even began to enjoy a foretaste of the triumph which had been one part of his dream through the long laborious years. But he was puzzled how to bring the full grandeur of his design clearly before this uninstructed audience, and after reflecting for a while in quest of concise yet adequate definitions, he launched out into an eloquent description of the ceremonial observed in conferring degrees at Dublin University. It may be surmised that many of the details were due to his own fondly brooding fancy, for not only did the highest learning in the land crowd the hall in their academic robes, but the Lord Lieutenant himself took a prominent part in the proceedings, which were enlivened by military music and thunderous salutes. Mr. Polymathers nearly toppled off his tricky stool more than once without noticing it in his excitement, as he rehearsed these splendid scenes, declaiming with great unction the formulas long since learned by all his heart, especially ego, auctoritate mihi concessa, and the rest, until he came to his peroration, and all this pomp and ceremony, mind yous, to the honour and glory of science and fine scholarship. It's a grand occasion, lads. It's an object any man might be proud to give. Here he pulled himself up, warmed by an unusually violent lurch that his theme was running away with him. But having by no means worked off his enthusiasm, he expended some of it, as a schoolboy might have done, in throwing a small bit of turf at a stately white hen, who just then sailed across the dark doorway like a little frigate under the most crowded canvas. She immediately took flight with floundering screeches, which drowned what the old man was muttering to himself. However, it was only admittote, admittote. After these revelations, Mr. Polymathers was looked up to more than ever, as one not only endowed with rare gifts, but destined by their means to scale heights of hardly realizable exaltation. Be all accounts, there was no knowing what he mightn't rise to be at Dublin College, the neighbours said. They also often remarked that it was a surprisin' thing to see a great scholar like him spendin' his time over teachin' them two young O'Beirnes. If the speaker happened to be afflicted with a twinge of envy about those educational advantages, he was apt to say, "Them two young bosthoons or gomorrals." But Dan and Nicholas were not, in fact, any such thing. Nicholas, indeed, quickly proved himself possessed of what Mr. Polymathers called a downright astonishing facility at the mathematics, far outstripping Dan, not quite to Dan's satisfaction, as he had always enjoyed the preeminence conferred by superior physical strength and a practical turn of mind. So well pleased was the old man with his eager pupil that he would have liked to do his teaching nothing for reward, but his host's hospitality and his own ambition would not permit this. Now and then he rather puzzled Nicholas by an apologetic tone in answering questions about his university career, and once at the end of a lesson he said, as if to himself, "May goodness forgive me if I'm takin' what he'd have done better with. But sure he's young, he's plenty of chances yet." However, as the time for his departure drew on, all his misgivings, if such he had, seemed to vanish away, and his thoughts became very apt to journey off blissfully to Dublin in the middle of the most interesting problems. Nicholas had to wait till they came back. Mr. Polymathers left Lisconnel on a fine autumn morning, when the air was so still that the flashing and twinkling of the many dewdrops seemed to make quite astir in it. The sky was as clear as any one of them, and in the golden light the wavering columns of blue smoke rose in curves softly transparent. He started with a buoyant step, as well he might, since he was setting out on the enterprise into which he had put all the spirit of his youth. He felt some regret at parting from his Lisconnel friends, but his plans and prospects were naturally very preoccupying, whereas he had the ampler leisure of the left behind to deplore his flitting, which seemed likely enough to be for good. Nearly 4 years, he had explained, must elapse before the crowning height of the B.A. degree could be won, and it was only just possible that he might manage to tramp back on a visit meanwhile, during some long vacation. This doubtful chance was cold comfort for that ardent scholar Nicholas Byrne, who grieved more than anybody else. Most ruefully did he help Dan to carry the candidate's undergraduate's library as far as the town, nor could he take more than a downcast pleasure in Mr. Polymathers's farewell gift to him of the raggedest Euclid. And as he stood watching the car out of sight, his eyes were as wistful as if a door briefly opened on glimpses of radiant vistas had been inexorably barred to his face. Yet after all, Mr. Polymathers's absence was not to be measured by years or months. One evening on the threshold of December, Lisconnel was lying roofed over by a massy livid black cloud, which came lumbering up and up interminably, and which the weatherwise estimated to contain as much snow as would smother the width of the earth. The north wind moaned and keened dismally under the toil of wafting on this portentous load, and its breath was bitingly sharp, so that when the lads came in from the forge, their grandfather said, "Ah, Dan, shut over the door, for there's a blast sweepin' through it 'ud freeze 10 regiments as stiff as staties." We usually take a large view of things at Lisconnel. Dan went to carry out this order, but instead of doing so, he suddenly shouted, "Murder alive, here's Mr. Polymathers." Through the grey gloaming came a Mr. Polymathers, very different from what he had been on that brilliant, hopeful morning only a few weeks ago, when he had stepped lightly and held his head up as if he were looking a friendly fortune in the face. Now his feet stumbled and dragged as he fared slowly against the wind's blustering, with his eyes on the ground, and his movements seemingly guided more by the weight of the bundle he carried than by his own will. Before he came within even loud shouting distance, everybody felt a presentiment of disaster, but he had not spoken a word to justify or discredit it by the time he got indoors. "Musha, and so it's yourself, sir," old Felix then repeated in a congratulatory tone. "Ah, but it's a hardy evenin', and it's perished you are, sir. Come in by the fire." "Ay, I'm back," Mr. Polymathers said slowly, after a hesitating pause, as if the remark had been interpreted to him by some second person. "I was bringin' the books, thinkin' the lad might use them. He's young enough. But I'm not come to stop on you," he added, speaking faster, "only just for this night. Early tomorrow I must be off to Ardnacray and try for the teachin' there again. 'Twas only on account of bringin' the books I came this way. I'll be on the road quite early." His insistence on this point made somehow a very melancholy impression on Felix, but he replied jovially, "Is it tomorrow? Bedad then, sir, don't you wish you may slip off on us that soon, and we after gettin' a hould of you agin? What fools we are, not if you was as slithery every inch of you as a water eel." The wraith of a relieved smile at this came over Mr. Polymathers's face. Still it looked so grey and withered, and his eyes were so sunken, and his large bony hands so shaky, that all with one consent refrained from questions which they were agog to ask, And when Mrs. Kehoe by and by dropped in, and being an inquisitive and not very quick-witted person, said, "Saints among us, it's Mr. Polymathers, and how's yourself, sir, and are you bringing home the grand decree?" Though they all listened eagerly for the reply, they wished she had held her tongue. "The divil a degree, ma'am," said Mr. Polymathers, "and never will." There was a short silence, and then he turned round on his stool. It was the same from which he had made his boast in the summer sunset. But Dan had meanwhile mended its broken leg with the handle of a worn-bladed spade. "I've given up," he said to them. "I no longer entertain the project of becoming a graduate, or, for the matter of that, an undergraduate of Dublin University. And if I'd done right, I'd never have taken up such an idea. I've put it out of me head, but it's been in me mind a great while, a terrible long while." "Look you here, Mr. Polymathers, sir, are you after gettin' any bad treatment from any people up in them places?" said Felix, who always liked better to lay a grievance on some human and possibly breakable head than to believe it the work of the vengeance baffling demon Bad Luck. "Not at all, not at all," said Mr. Polymathers, when the question reached him. "I've nothing to complain of. They're very respectable people in Dublin, and it's a fine city. But me head's a bit giddy yet wid the drivin' they have in the streets, that makes one stupid. I mind there was a car tatterin' along, and I crossin' over the College Green had me down on the stones, only a dacent lad gripped a hould of me and whirled me inside the College gates. There I was before I rightly knew anything had happened to me, and I after spendin' the best part of me life gettin' to it. 'Twasn't the way I thought it'd be, but the College is as grand as any notion I had of it. Only since I've seen it, 'tis like a dream to me that ever I set foot in it, just a sort of dream. Great ancient places the squares are. I walked round the whole of them before I found the hall. A couple of chaps in uniform like came axin' me business, and I told them fast enough that I was a candidate. Goodness help me. And the hall's a spacious and splendid apartment. Only it was strange now to see it full of nothin' but young fellows, scarce older than the two lads here. I might sure enough have known the way it'd be, but I'd come to consider, but somehow it seemed to put me out, as if I'd no call to be there at all. There was one of them began pricin' me old hat, and another of them tripped him up against a black marble construction with a pair of angels atop of it that there is on the wall. Sure they were just spalpeens, but I'll give you me word, when they called me up to the examiner's table, there was a young gentleman sittin' at it in his black gown and cap wid the tassel, bound to be one of the college fellows and every sort of a fine scholar, and for all the age there was on him, he might have been me son or me grandson. And so he handed me over the little black Virgil, with the page opened where I was to exhibit me acquaintance with the text. It was merely a bit of an oration of Queen Dido's that I've known every line of these 40 years as well as I know me own name, and better. And what came over me is more than I can tell, but the minute I took the book in me hand, it seemed to me as if every atom of sense and meanin' slipped out of the words, or out of me head. I couldn't say which, and I just stood staring at them, and staring until everything else got whirling round about me, fit to shake the panes out of the big windows and the pictures off the walls. Belike himself perceived I was flustered, for "Take your time," says he, and after a while they stood steady enough. But the Lord be good to me, sorra a syllable of the sense came back, and to me that I well knew it was all up wid me. And I was thinking me father's son had no business to be standing there making a show of meself in the middle of Trinity College. So the lad in the cap said again, "Take your time, sir, take your time." But I said to him, "God help me, sir, I've taken very nigh all I'll get, for I declare to you, lad, I'm over 70 years of age. But as for your time, sir," I said, "I'll be wasting no more of it." And with that I put down the book, and out I went. I mind the sun in the square nearly dazzled the eyes out of me fool's head. I never seen it blazin' brighter. and there was a big bell somewhere booming away, as if they'd set the heart of the world tollin'. It's ringing in me ears yet. And a couple of days after that I quit out of Dublin, and I've been tramping back to the country, taking me time, as he said. There's no hurry now about anything. So that was the end of me university degree. I just wish I could get discoursin' with that young feller," said old Felix vindictively, "himself and his tassel on his cap." "Sure, man, 'twas no fault of his," said Mr. Polymathers, "and I can live widout a degree if that's all. Me betters did before me. To tell you the truth, I've thought often enough as I was comin' along now, that I do not know how at all I'd have had the face to meet me poor father one of these days, and I cocked up with a baccalaureatus in artibus, and he wid not so much as a dacint stone over his grave to commemorate his name. That was the most illustrious polymath in the county Sligo, wid more larnin' in the tip of his ear than ever I got into me old skull. Never a hap'orth of good was I at anything except the trifle of mathematics, but he was as great at the classics. I used to humbug meself sometimes, lettin' on I hankered after it, because it would ha' gratified him maybe to hear of the event. But little I ever done to please him, God forgive me, let alone goin' and makin' an old fool of meself up at Trinity College. 'Twas a terrible upset to him when I'd turn agin the priesthood, after he had the money saved up for the seminary and all. Words about it we had, and the ind of it was that he put it all into me brother Ned's little farm. Ned had no more fancy for learning than the beasts of the field. A trifle of it would have come in very handy sometimes for buying me books, however it was not to be. And the books there, I only brought them along to have wid you for the youngest lad. Ay, Nicholas, he has a head on his shoulders for the mathematics, I can tell you. He might do something yet if he got his chances. They're no use to me now, and I'd as lief be shut of the sight of them. And tomorrow I'll be off to Onyxcreeg." So the gaunt old man talked on, groping his way out of hesitating pauses and straying into dreamy meditations, as if he sometimes forgot his story and sometimes his hearers. They did not know what a life wreck it outlined, but they saw and surmised enough to make him think of himself as the creature, and speak to him with more deference than if he had returned in a radiant glow of success, symbolized, as some of them had anticipated, by scarlet robes as splendid, at least, as Father Rooney's at High Mass. And Felix O'Beirne took occasion of a madly skirling gust to say: "Listen now to that, sir, and don't be talkin' wild of travellin' off tomorrow. If I might be sayin' so, you're a deal better stay quiet where you are this minute. And as for teachin', sure it's proud and thankful the two boys would be for ever a bit more. There's Nicholas mopin' about like an old hin that's lost her chickens ever since you quit." Mr. Polymathers did stop quiet, very quiet, but he taught the boys no more. In fact, he did nothing except sit all day staring into the fire, as if he had lost something in it. Once, after Nicholas had sat looking very hard at him for a long time with the ragged Euclid ostentatiously open at a crux, he seemed to rouse up, and putting out a hand for the book, began an explanation. But it died away unfinished in an aimless muttering, which both shocked and saddened Nicholas, and the experiment was not repeated. Then, towards Christmas time, all the neighbours were saying that Mr. Polymathers would greatly fail to what he had been, and Bridget O'Beirne reported that you might as well be argufyin' wid a scutty wren to swally down the full of the duck's dish as persuading him to take a reasonable bite and sup. Dr. Hamilton from the dispensary, who was consulted on the case, conceded, Bridget told inquirers, that he might be after getting a sort of stroke like unbeknownst. But her own opinion was that he had, so to speak, lost the knot off his thread, and 'twould be much if he didn't slip away out of it on them, afore they seen e'er another green leaf on the bushes. It was at any rate more than happened. One snowy afternoon, when he had been busy for some time scrawmin' a manner of letter, which related, he said, to the disposition of his property, Mr. Polymathers grew so much worse that Dan and Nicholas ran off for the doctor and the priest, and before their arrival could possibly be expected, it became evident that he could not wait to receive them. Bridget O'Beirne, deploring the hap by his bed in the small room off the kitchen, thought a few minutes before he went that she heard him murmuring something coherent, as she called to little Rosy Corcoran, "Child alive, me head's bothered, come in here and listen. Can you make out at all what he's sayin'?" Rosy came reluctantly and listened. "I think," she whispered, "it's some sort of prayers like what his Reverence says." "Ah, then, glory be to God for that itself," said Bridget. "There might be a good chance for him after all." But she had been misinformed. The words Mr. Polymathers was muttering over and over to himself were, "Admitto te, admitto te." Chapter 8. Honoris Causa. The evening of the day after Mr. Polymathers died was a very wild, black and white one out of doors all round Lisconnel, yet notwithstanding the flakes in the air and underfoot, the O'Beirnes had received some company. Not at a wake, however. The purpose of their assembly was to discuss a serious business matter, upon which old Felix O'Beirne wished for friendly counsel. Hence his contemporary, old Paddy Ryan, had prodded little round craters in the snow with his thick stick all along the good step of bleak road which lay between his house and the forge, and with him had come on the same errand Terence Kilfoyle, who, although of so much junior standing, was esteemed as a man of notably shrewd sense and judgment. But then neither he nor his neighbours knew how often he took and gave Bessy Kilfoyle's advice. These two were present by express invitation, but another pair of guests, the Dooleys, would never have been asked for the sake of their opinion, which they were indeed encouraged to keep to themselves, and appeared at this domestic crisis merely by virtue of family ties. Old Felix had always thought little of his daughter Maggie's mental powers, and less ever since her marriage with Peter Dooley, who kept a shop in the town and could be described as an old gombeen man, if one wished to regard him from an unfavourable point of view, which his father-in-law not uncommonly did. He had been heard to say of Peter that the chap was that smooth-spoken you might think he was after swallowing one of those gracy dips, only he'd liefer be chatin' some poor body over the sellin' of it. A perhaps not inexcusable preference. As for Peter, he contemplated humanity with a jovial cynicism, and rather enjoyed the society of the old blacksmith, despite the gruff sarcasms which sometimes made their womankind turn the conversation apprehensively. He had been heard to say of Felix that it was easy work running down other people's business, and small blame to the old man if he had a fancy for a light job now and again, when he would be tired pounding the old iron at a profit you couldn't see to pick up without a strong pair of spectacles. Proximity had brought to the consultation Mrs. Carbery and Tim O'Meara from adjacent doors, and they, with old ancient Mrs. O'Beirne and her daughter and the two lads, formed quite a large party about the fire. The business to be brought before them was Mr. Polymathers' will. Now, lest it should be thought that unseemly haste was displayed in attending to this affair, while Mr. Polymathers still lay in the little next room, I must explain that for special occasions the nature of the funeral arrangements depended upon the result of the conference, and how deeply important such a point would be considered at Lisconnel I need remind no one, who has occasionally been perplexed by our propensity for the pinching and scraping which takes toll of a lifelong penury, and a brief show of pomp may invest the last scene of all. This propensity is not seldom misconstrued into the outcome of a mere personal vanity, whereas it has its root in the worthier sentiment of veneration for our kind. Old Paddy Murphy, who has subsisted all his life upon an insufficiency of pitaties, and inhabited a largish sty, never loses the sense that he owes something better to himself in his character of a human being, and he takes painful steps to ensure the ultimate discharge of the debt. One of these days he who has hitherto come and gone in unimposing guise shall be borne on wheels if possible, but here I mention grandeur never even dreamed of up at remote Lisconnel, in unwonted state, certain to draw the gaze of every passer-by. But as if with a fine touch of courtesy, he so times his assertion of dignity that none of his fellows shall thereby be abashed, nor envy bitten. No ragged wayfarer shall wish to change places with him as he passes solemnly along, nor grudge him the unshared splendour of his sombre equipage, not even if it display the crowning glory of woolly black plumes to waggle over his head. Accordingly, when Pat has died on his humble bed, which is as likely as not just earth tempered with straw, under his rifted thatch, through which he may see the stars glimmer with nothing except the smoke haze and gathering mists between, he is conveyed thence with whatever pomp and circumstance his savings permit, and all his neighbours feel that the right thing has been done. It is true that Mr. Polymathers has given no sign of any such sentiment. When discreetly sounded on the subject during his last days, he had replied, "Ah, man, it's very immaterial," in a tone of indifference as unmistakable as the phrase was ambiguous. And from this fact, coupled with his written instructions, it might, one would have thought, safely have been inferred that he desired no costly magnificence at his obsequies. Yet the point was obscured in his late host's mind by a thick cloud of doubts and scruples. Mr. Polymathers had died surprisingly rich, not less than £25 7 shillings and 3 having been counted awe-strickenly out of his leathern pouch. The ground rents of all Lisconnel did not reach to such a figure. It had been larger still before his disastrous expedition to the university, but it had never undergone any diminution so long as he abode under Felix O'Beirne's roof. On the first Saturday after his convalescence, he had inquired, pouch in hand, "And what might be the amount of my pecuniary debt to you, sir?" And old O'Beirne had replied, "And you spendin' your time puttin' the height o' learnin' into the two lads' head, bedad, sir, it's debt the other way round, supposin' there was to be any talk about it." The same little scene, dwindled at last into a mere form and ceremony, had taken place on every succeeding Saturday. Not that Mr. Polymathers did not feel he had grounds for more than merely formal demur, but he was then facing the steep hill of his ambition, and had sometimes to stoop as he climbed. But now, when he had turned back baffled and all his climbing was done, old Felix had no engrossing object to blunt a sense of many scruples that must be removed before he himself or his family could with honour derive profit from the event, as they would do if Mr. Polymathers's instructions were carried out. For by that document, which he had finished drawing up only just in time, all his property was left unreservedly to Nicholas O'Beirne, with the injunction that as little of it as possible might be expended upon the burying. Of course it was an extraordinary thing that such a piece of good fortune should befall such a number of pounds accrue to anybody at all. But apart from this there seemed to be nothing very strange in the bequest. Everybody knew that Mr. Polymathers had entertained a great opinion entirely of Nicholas's abilities. Time and again he had said that the lad would be heard of in the world if he got his chance of some good teaching, and he once more expressed the same conviction, only at fuller length and in finer language, in the composition which had been the last effort of his wearied brain. "It would give me," he wrote, "the utmost satisfaction to think that the legacy may eventually smooth his path to the attainment of those university distinctions which have eluded my own grasp." And almost his latest moment of consciousness had been pervaded by a faint thrill of pleased pride at the turn of the sentence as he read it over. This high style was not, however, maintained throughout, and the purport could not be misunderstood. Furthermore, everybody knew that he had said he had not a relation belonging to him in this world, and that being so, it was natural enough for him to make a promising and favourite pupil his heir. At first sight, therefore, no difficulties presented themselves, but old Felix slept upon the matter, and by morning grave doubts had risen in his mind. The gist of them was that, if they took and grabbed the old gentleman's bit of money, and he after dyin' all his loan up among them there, wid ne'er a one of his own folks near him to see he had his rights, it might look ugly enough agin them, and set some people passin' remarks he'd be long sorry to have made on him or any of his name, and that for the precluding of such animadversions it might behoove them to provide a buryin' not merely decent but very respectable whatever, and to expend the remainder of Mr. Polymathers's personality upon a headstone for his grave and masses for his soul. To set against these apprehensions were Mr. Polymathers's wishes and Nicholas's interests, and the longer the old man balanced them in his mind, the more perplexing became their tremulous poise. So at last, goaded by the urgent necessity for a prompt decision, he turned to seek it among his neighbours. He could not forbear a hope that their voices might be convincingly in favour of giving Nicholas his chances. Still his strongest feeling was that it would be a relief to get the matter settled one way or the other. Very different in its degree of intensity was the interest with which his grandson Nicholas looked forward to the issue. The question to be decided seemed to him of almost as vital importance as if it were whether or no the sun should rise again next morning. For him, at least, it depended upon that whether his world should loom back again in a dreary blankness, or waken lit with new and wondrous gleams. Nicholas's thirst for knowledge and love of learning were much more essentially part and parcel of him than his hands and eyes, and had so far found little except dreams and desires to thrive upon. Even before the memorable summer evening when the gaunt old man in the curious big hat had asked for the night's lodging, which lengthened into a season's sojourn, he had often wandered among visions of places where there were as many books as anybody could read, a dozen maybe, and some people in it with a power of book learning, as much perhaps as his reverence or the doctor, only neither priest nor quality, but just neighbours whom he could question about anything that came into his head, as he used to question his grandfather and Paddy Ryan and Terence Kilfoyle, until he got tired of being asked in reply, "Musha, good gracious, and who could be telling you that?" an answer which had repeatedly left him a discouraged atom of bewilderment, symbolically environed by our wide-spreading bog. Since Mr. Polymathers's visit, these visions had grown clearer, but not under any rays of hope. His initiation into the elements of mathematics had pointed out the road along which he should travel, but had simultaneously revealed all its obstacles, insurmountable for him solitary and unequipped. In those days his mind was constantly fumbling at some insoluble problem, with the sense of frustration that one has who gropes vainly in the dark, well knowing how a single unattainable match flare would put what he is seeking into his hands, and no brighter prospect seemed to lie before him anywhere in his future. So when he suddenly learned that Mr. Polymathers had left all his money, sums and sums, to be spent on getting schooling for Nicholas O'Beirne, and when the sums and sums were actually counted out on the table, he felt as if a door into enchanted regions had majestically opened in a blank wall. That night he went to bed in a state of joyous excitement, only dashed by some pangs of self-reproach for being unable to feel more sorrow at the flickering out of his poor old teacher's dim life. He had to frame excuses for himself by recollecting how his great aunt Bridget had said, "Ah, sure the crathur's better off, God knows. What else 'ud he do, and the heart of him broke, but quit out of it if he got the chance? Ay, bedad, some people have all the quare good luck." And when he got up, with his happiness still fresh and strange in the morning, there was his grandfather declaring he didn't know if they'd have a right to touch the bit of money at all. It might be no thing to go do. Schoolin' or no schoolin', he wouldn't be givin' people any call to say the O'Beirnes were after playin' a dirty trick. At this Nicholas's experience was like that of a desert traveller who should see a mirage of palms and pools grow swiftly before his delighted eyes into a substantial oasis, and then anon, or ever he could approach it, shimmer back with all its sheen and shade into a mocking illusion again. For thus did it fare with his hopes as his grandfather talked of renouncing Mr. Polymathers's bequest. Moreover, the grounds which the old man alleged forbade his grandson, lothfully though he listened, to utter a word of protest, and even made himself half ashamed of his vehement longing to do so. Nicholas had been an O'Beirne for but 14 years, but he had already entered upon his inheritance of family pride. Only he could not bring himself to believe that the honour of his house called for so prodigious a sacrifice, and he could have urged a dozen arguments against it if some other person had been the legatee. As it was, all that delicacy would permit him to do for himself was to give piteously inadequate expression to his sentiments in casual remarks about the grandeur of getting a bit of learning, and the difficulty of understanding some things out of one's own head. Altogether that day was the longest and most anxious that he had ever spent. Dan also, though his fortunes were not involved to the same extent as his younger brother's, was not easy in his mind. All day he had been thinking rather badly of himself, and suspecting that other people thought worse of him than he deserved, and the reflection was depressing and irritating. The news of the legacy certainly had not given him unmixed pleasure, as he felt that it ought to have done, but at the same time he was aware that he neither grudged nor envied Nicholas his good fortune, and that this unamiable frame of mind would nevertheless probably be ascribed to him if he betrayed any dissatisfaction or disapproval. The truth was that he could not help feeling some mortification at the way in which both Mr. Polymathers and his grandfather assumed the forge to be his destiny and portion in life. Dan did not by any means despise it. He took an interest in the work, and a pride in the fact that farmers sent their horses thither from beyond the town, so well reputed was old Felix O'Beirne's shoeing. But it did not follow that he wanted to be a blacksmith all his days. Even if he had done so, he was 16, and consequently of an age to resent any prescribed calling, especially since he knew that the selection here had been made as a result of an unfavourable comparison of his abilities with those of another person. "Dan is no fool, mind you," Mr. Polymathers had said once, "but for intellect you need never name him on the same day of the month as Nicholas," a verdict which fell with a slight shock upon Dan, accustomed to the precedence given by 2 years' seniority, superior strength, and a more practical turn of mind. What was far more serious, however, Dan secretly cherished an ambition of his own. It took the form of thinking that it would be a wonderfully fine thing if he could ever get to learn the doctoring, and be able to drive about on a car like Dr. Hamilton, with a name and a remedy for everybody's ailment. A particularly fine thing it seemed to understand the construction of bones and joints, a knowledge which would put it in his power to prevent people from coming to such grief as, for instance, poor Matt Halloran down at Duffclane, who must limp on a crooked leg to the end of his days, because the man who pulled in his dislocated ankle for him had made botch of it, through not knowing rightly what he was about. Dan had been much impressed, too, by several cases where a few drops of brown stuff out of a bottle had put people to sleep when various aches and pains had long hindered them from closing an eye, a result which the neighbours were occasionally disposed to view with mistrust, as rather probably wrought through the agency of some queer old pistrogues, that is, charms, but which to Dan's mind proved the possession of a skill as enviable as it was beneficent. Beside it, hammering out horseshoes appeared a tedious and aimless pursuit, and he sometimes thumped away in a very vague dream of one of these days finding himself more congenially employed. Now, however, it was perfectly clear to him that if Nicholas took off with himself to get scholarship, his own portion must be to stick to the anvil. For otherwise, supposing his grandfather got past his work, or anything else happened him, there would be nobody left to look after Dan's great aunt, who was not very old, and his great grandmother, who was such a wonderful age entirely that no one could say how much longer she mightn't live. Even the wildest dreams are not quite easy to scare away, and it was this chiefly that marred his content with Mr. Polymathers's testamentary dispositions. Still, when he heard his grandfather's doubts and saw his brother's downcast looks, he became almost as anxious as Nicholas himself that the neighbours might talk away the old man's scruples and allow the will to stand. End of section 5.